Hi everyone, this is your host Annie Zhang, and this is Hello Metaverse. In the last year, play-to-earn games, now also known as GameFi, have become a promising new frontier for both blockchain enthusiasts who are seeking a deeper purpose in what NFTs and digital ownership can enable, and also game developers who are intrigued by this new model of publishing games where it can bypass the walled gardens of the mobile app stores. At the same time, given the nascency of this industry, there's a ton of skepticism and speculation. A common critique is towards the most commercially successful play-to-earn game to date, Axie Infinity. Some complain that the game is not fun to play, others question whether or not it actually helps people earn money, and many are concerned about the financial vulnerability of the platform, as it was victim to a huge security hack, losing around $25 million in digital assets in this past March. For Yat Siu, Axie Infinity is to blockchain gaming what Angry Birds was to mobile gaming. While it barely scratches the surface of what opportunities blockchain games can unlock, it got everyone paying attention and giving it a try. Yat also happens to be one of the first investors in Axie Infinity, but more broadly is one of the most prolific investors in the blockchain and gaming space through his company Animoca Brands. I view Yat as one of the great philosophers of Web3, being able to see far beyond current trends and buzzwords, and we discuss a range of topics today, from digital property rights, capitalism and hypercapitalism, the democratic system, and why decentralization fosters innovation. A bit more about Animoca Brands. It is one of the most critical builders of the Web3 ecosystem today, having made investments and work very closely with companies such as The Sandbox, Dapper Labs, Sky Mavis, OpenSea, MetaMask, and so many more. They recently partnered with the ApeCoin DAO to launch the ApeCoin token as well. Here is my conversation with Yat Siu. I want to start off with this podcast to understand a bit of your background because you have spent a long time in gaming and have really seen a lot of evolutions within the industry. So first, kind of tell us what fostered your passion for the gaming space.
I guess one thing about me is I grew up in Austria, in Vienna, and really a child of the 70s. So I am dating myself. And my first sort of introduction really to the gaming space was when I actually received a Texas Instruments. This was in the early 1980 or 1981, obviously at a very young age. And there was a little game in there. I remember this game in particular. It was called Parsec. And it was a very simple shooter game. And it was really the Texas Instruments TI-99 was really just a standard giant calculator, really. That's really all it was. But it had this additional sort of thing in there called BASIC. And, obviously a programming language. And it allowed me to sort of make some simple modifications and changes and sort of write my own code. And that's kind of what got me into the whole space. And then eventually, when I got my Commodore 64 and eventually the Atari ST, I ended up getting into the whole quasi-hacking and modding space a little bit, where you were basically able to modify aspects of the game a little bit, basically go into the code. And, it was never really designed to be this way, but people just ended up doing this mostly in the beginning to sort of, help you move along inside the game. But then afterwards, you just started having fun with that. And my original background was music, in the sense that both my parents had a musical background. That's why I grew up in Vienna. And when I studied music, one of the things about me was that I wasn't nearly as talented as any of my other colleagues, but I used the computer to basically write composition software as a way to move ahead, shall we say, right? So it's equivalent of using a calculator in math class in the 80s, which would have been completely disallowed as well back then. And that wasn't particularly impressive for my teachers, who basically just thought that I was effectively cheating. But the online community where I had started sharing the software, which was a pre-internet service called CompuServe, actually took to it and appreciated it and started sending me money. And at that point, I was still a child, and I didn't have a bank account yet. And that was kind of an interesting experience for me to understand that actually the virtual world had economic opportunity, even if it was relatively small, even back in the 80s. And that eventually led me to a job at Atari, who reached out. I didn't join Atari to make games per se. I joined Atari because of the MIDI software and the music software I wrote, but it got into the production side, on the gaming side, getting exposure to what Atari was doing, and eventually being involved in a number of projects. So that's kind of what got me in there. And both as an end user and as someone who was a little bit in the background as well, I'd always had a love of games really since, let's say, the 80s. And for me, it was just a very natural space. I never thought of something different to me. And, for me, it wasn't like I had a normal career track either. The only quasi-normal career track was that my parents, particularly my mother, wanted me to become a musician. That was the only thing. But after I started working, I came to realize that in the rest of the world, becoming a musician was actually an unusual job track as well. So there was nothing standard about this approach anyway. And it just kind of led me from one path to another.
That's an incredible story. I'm curious, what were people wanting to buy from you? Was it the actual compositions or was it the software that you were making?
It was a software. So the MIDI software, the way it worked was that you could just use a keyboard. And one of the strange things back then, was people were writing music on paper, which was the standard opinion, of course. But it meant that for those people who could really imagine it and had perfect pitch or something, it was very easy for them to write down the music, perhaps. But for normal mere mortals like myself, I needed to hear it first. And therefore, often I would play it on the piano and then I would write it down. And it was kind of an imperfect process. It's not something that was natural for me. And I think it wasn't natural for most people, as it turned out, right? And this is sort of the example, again, what technology broadly does, which is it actually amateurizes a capability in a sense, right? Calculator amateurized math, if you will, for instance, right? And what MIDI software did is it amateurized the ability to compose music more easily. And of course, that started to progress better over time because things like, harmony, for instance, could be self-corrected in MIDI software because it could analyze things for you that you would have to think of every time. And if you were well-versed in it, then it was fine. But for most people, you can't. And of course, today, this type of software, basically with loops and so on, is so much more sophisticated than it was back then. But technology really does facilitate and amateurize access to really things that would have been perhaps considered either complex or out of reach, right? So that's really what people initially bought. And then eventually, it led me into the whole multimedia space. So we started doing, 3D rendering, into sort of, 3D graphics, which were very primitive back then, but it got us entirely into, I guess, the arts and media aspect of technology and computing, which of course in the 80s and early 90s was still very primitive as compared to today, but back then was considered quite cutting edge. In fact, one of the things I remember, I think this was late 80s, I actually submitted a piece to the Pre-Ars Electronica, which is kind of a blend of virtual and AR technology on the Atari, which won the special recognition. And I remember it was really primitive, but back then it was sort of an interesting artistic expression about combining the virtual and the digital realities back then. And we were celebrating back then the amazing work that Pixar did back then with the first, I guess, quasi-mainstream 3D animation, which again looked very primitive back then. And I think it took almost I don't know how many months to render or even. But, those were the early days where there was also a lot of experimentation. And similarly to, I guess, today with blockchain, a hell of a lot of imagination as to where the future could go, right? To basically say, hey, this is really cool and interesting. And now when you look back at it, what we projected as people in the space was very deep, I guess, because we imagined all these possibilities. But looking back at it now, it's like looking at black and white television or that, and you go like, oh my goodness, how could we ever have thought that this was something that could really be mainstream now in the future?
I also think a lot of your story is akin to the creator space right now. Like there's a lot of artists who otherwise would never really get into technology, but because now there's sort of another outlet for them to get attention or be useful or add value to people, they're actually some of the earliest adopters of blockchain tech, which is kind of unexpected. So speaking of blockchain, I want to talk about how you gained conviction around blockchain gaming, or I guess now we're calling it GameFi. What was sort of the transition there? And I read somewhere that you actually became kind of jaded with gaming for a period during like the mobile gaming fad. So talk to us about that and then how you got to where you are now.
Fast forward a little bit from my past. Basically, I started coming back into mobile gaming in 2010, 2011, right? And really what is the predecessor of Animoca Brands, which is Animoca itself, started becoming one of the largest mobile game providers, really with a game initially called Pretty Pet Salon, which in Asia anyway, actually globally was an early sensation. One of the very first games that really took advantage of in-app purchases at the App Store, for instance. And we became one of the largest mobile game providers in 2011 The story about how we got into mobile gaming was I sold our enterprise business, which is Outplays, an email business, which I had built earlier to IBM. And I basically had a 3-year non-compete on anything enterprise. And coincidentally, I had a young child and I had an iPhone. And I didn't want to carry around these flashcards that we give our babies so that they can sort of be stimulated in terms of connecting the image and the word. And you would buy these baby Einstein flashcards. I think it was like 20 a pack for like, I don't know, $19. It was something outrageously expensive, but parents, right? They just spend everything on their kids. And eventually I would carry around like literally hundreds of these in a bag, because when we go out, we just consume them really fast and just repeat that. I said, well, why don't I just put that on my iPhone? And back then that seemed like a ridiculous idea, because why would you put what was back then, $1,000, well, actually still today, I guess $1,000 device, into the hands of a toddler. And so the team built it really just to amuse me, I think, and say, okay, sure, yeah, let's just do that. And it was not difficult to do, obviously, it was just flashcards. And weeks thereafter, or maybe a little longer than that, the team came to me and then said, and they're like, hey, this baby flashcards, do you know what happened? I don't know. Like, I don't have an idea. And he said it was downloaded like 1.5 million times or something in a really short period of time. And,
Wow.
From an activity standpoint, back then, those are huge numbers in terms of,
Yeah.
what happened? Well, first of all, a lot of people obviously agreed that putting $1,000 device in the hands of a toddler was a good idea. But the other thing, of course, it demonstrated just the power of what the smartphone could do, and that it was going to basically change the world. And that was sort of our trigger, which began, interesting enough, from an education perspective and then went into the entertainment side. So got into gaming, and one of the things that happened there was that we grew really, really fast, because we're also one of the earliest players. And I guess this is the other thing about, if you're able to be early, then you can take advantage and perhaps even somewhat shape the space. But I think the big surprise and wake-up call was that in early 2012, Apple had removed all of our apps. At that point, we had probably we had hundreds of apps in the App Store already. Most of them were games. And what we had figured out really in 2011 is that if we launch a game a week, then we would always be at the top of the App Store, because the App Store ranking was fairly primitive. And as I guess one does when one needs to be enterprising, you basically figure out how to get to the top of the rankings, because back then rankings was equal to top discoverability. Now, Apple hadn't figured out a way in which they will deal with the ranking issue, which today they completely abolished it. I mean, if you go into the App Store, you no longer can really find it. But back then, as the main mechanism, everyone was trying to find a way to get to the top of the App Store, whether it's through marketing, whether it's this and that. And we just did it through very heavy cross promotion. But, at that point, we were still a relatively small company in Hong Kong with like 160 staff or something. Nobody called us from Apple and said, hey, we don't like that business practice of you launching an app a week, presumably because it might be considered like spamming the App Store, for instance, because I think we were the most prolific launcher of apps on the App Store at that point. And in early 2012, simply hit delete on all of our apps. And that to me was like a rude awakening in terms of what it meant to be on a platform like this. And having really grown up earlier with open source software and building Outplays, which was entirely built on Linux and open source systems, being suddenly captive to the walled garden that is the App Store was a bit of a shock. And it took us over 1.5 years to get back on the App Store. And it was really in relation to the fact that Apple had then opened an office in Hong Kong. China suddenly became a focal market for Apple because it wasn't important before. And they needed to get capable developers, I guess, to develop product for the region. And suddenly we were useful again. And of course, the team that we engaged with had no idea about us, right? They didn't know the background. But to this day, I have no idea who, I guess, in Cupertino pushed the button. The only thing we were told that, people who had tried to lobby on our behalf were like, oh, this is very serious. And, we're somewhere bad actors. And we had engaged in a form of, I guess, account spamming and hacking, just all sorts of accusations. But of course, in the court of law of Apple, there is no judiciary. There is no appeals process. All it is the decision of an individual who we don't even know who that is, right? And so speaking in terms of what led to our conviction on blockchain gaming, this was part of the journey. The reason I'm sharing this is because one of the things about blockchain gaming, or actually anything on blockchain, is the permissionless nature. The ability that you can now actually publish something and own something, despite the fact that, maybe even the issuer themselves can no longer alter your ownership of that. And it comes a little bit when you think of the past of our own experiences with games, but also our own experiences as end users of games. When a game shuts down, all the time you invested in, all the legacy that is inside the items disappears with it. And I think that's the other thing which has also fascinated us about blockchain gaming, which is now, even if a game dies, you can then still own the assets. And a lot of critiques around, well, what's the point in owning the assets? Because after all, if the game is dead, then aren't the assets worthless? But I think this is the point here now, because if you actually have the assets, you have a way in which you can reach the entire community as a community itself. You don't lose the legacy of that community. And you can, if you wish to, rebuild it either as a separate spin-off, or maybe even the community themselves can come together, or another game can decide to adopt it and use these assets and items. I think the other thing also was just the fact that because it's on-chain, we were no longer going to be dependent on big platforms that basically sort of controlled everything. And speaking of the jadedness, so when we got back into the App Store, at that point, the whole face of mobile gaming or gaming generally had changed. One of the big changes, of course, was that marketing was no longer just a function of what was perhaps most entertaining or fun for the consumer. It was very much about what was pleasing to the App Store. And it wasn't the same as bearing gifts to the king, as it were. It was about adding features that they wanted you to. Right? Oh, we have a new AR feature. So, if you incorporate these new features, then, we might feature you. And featuring at that point became gold. And so one of the reasons, I suppose, that for Apple, and if you look back in the past, there were a lot of battles that Apple had with people like advertising networks, right? They're like, oh, we don't like that people advertise on there, for instance, and use third-party ways because they can manipulate the App Store rankings. But really what it meant was it would take away control from Apple to say who deserves to basically have success on the platform, right? Because it might take away maybe their particular agendas. And Apple does direct that. It's Google and all the other platforms do that as well, because they want to push new technology, they want to push new features. And so it became very much almost like developing things that might please Apple, not necessarily because they were the best features. So that was kind of one where the entire marketing department shifted. The second one was in relation to became the more extractive features in gaming. Because in gaming, in mobile gaming with free to play, really less than 3%, typically 1.5% on average, convert. The majority, play games entirely for free. So you actually don't ever pay any money, which means that as the scale and size of these games grow, you have to extract ever more value from the 1 or 2 percentile. And it is really just a one-way street, because whatever value you generate is purely for entertainment and I guess social status, if you will, but there's no value that goes back. One of the reasons I was getting jaded about that is because, all the features that we were building were really sort of features that were focused towards, benefiting the platform. In this case, what Apple wanted or Google wanted, because at that point, featuring was discovery. If you weren't featured, you weren't able to get access to users and so on. But the other thing that really started to sort of grate on me back then was that because gaming, generally speaking, free-to-play gaming in particular, has a very low conversion rate. It's typically less than 3%. On average, actually 1.5% of people in free-to-play games or mobile games are the ones who pay, as the majority don't pay at all. And it meant that in order to make more revenue from this, you had to be ever more extractive in terms of being able to sort of generate value from them. You may remember some of the headlines back then where people were like, oh, people in gaming spend up to 50 to 100,000 US dollars inside free-to-play games. It's actually not that different from some of the criticisms that blockchain games have today, in terms of, oh, what are these people spending? Tens of thousands of dollars on game items. Well, guess what? That's what people were doing already 10, 15 years ago, except for things that have no value and never will have value because it was not designed that way. So the idea of spending large money on digital items, and actually when you think about it, digital status, has really been around for a long time. And what was becoming more troubling for me as well was that in order to compete in this space, you had to become more extractive. And in order to sort of do that, you basically had to employ more methods that were starting to become, frankly, more questionable, which has led to criticism of the gaming industry, but continues to this day, because you can't sustain, I think the misunderstanding is that people think that these free-to-play games, that there's maybe a large conversion rate and everyone pays $5. The average conversion, the average ARPU might be in the few dollars, but it's a few percentile, which is still millions of customers in the game, that ends up spending literally tens of thousands of dollars. And again, this is where blockchain gaming starts to become really attractive, because you could spend as much money as you like, as long as you're willing to do so, except now you have the ability to sell it to someone else, for instance, if you no longer want to play. Whatever time and capital that you have invested in the game actually is not entirely lost. And it may not necessarily always return what you put in. That's not really the point here. It's the fact that you have the ability to recoup some of that investment, which also means that your net entertainment of playing a game is no longer as costly, because someone else might come and take over your assets, for instance, on your behalf, or you might earn potentially some yield on it as you move on and play another game, for fun and entertainment, which personally I think as an industry is far more sustainable as well, because it just keeps capital flowing within the game industry that benefits the end user far, far more, right? So there are so many benefits around blockchain gaming that we were just like, hey, this is the future. And, for ourselves, we always had an affinity towards owning our digital assets anyway. So in that sense, it was something that we just felt we had to do.
That's a wild story. I can't believe that Apple just banned you off of the platform for being really smart, but that's just such a classic Apple thing. And I'm so glad that we're moving to a new world where maybe Apple's not going to become the middleman. So speaking of play to earn, I want to get kind of philosophical with our discussion here and really understand, some of these broader principles that really detach from just gaming itself and is going to be applicable to how people participate on the internet, period. So I do want to start with play to earn because that's become the predominant model of game development that has evolved within the GameFi space. But there are still a lot of criticism or things that people don't understand about it, right? People are hearing that just can play games and make money, and that can become a way to earn disposable income. I think there's certain other people who are just excited about the collectibles and like the exclusive items that you're able to buy, or even flipping assets. What is more of the broader way to think about play to earn? Is it really just about making money while you're playing games, or does it represent a behavior that's going to be more long-term than that?
So I think the more fashionable thing as of late is not just necessarily say play to earn, but also play and earn, for instance, right? And I think it's more reflective of the idea that you don't necessarily have to play to make money, but you can. I think this is really the big point here, which is that for some people, this could be a living wage, but for other people, this is just, entertainment and for fun, and maybe should never be more than that. Now, what really happens when you participate in a play to earn game and have the capacity to make money is not for money's sake in itself. It's really just the fair contribution of the network effect that you're contributing towards the game, in which value is then shared across the entire community. Whether you then choose to sort of partake in it in the way that others do, that is entirely up to you. Now, what I mean by that is when you look at, for instance, people playing blockchain games today, or just general sort of free mobile games, as I said earlier, right, only a few percentile actually pay. 97 to 99% never pay anything inside the game. Now, in the space of the millions of customers that are playing any kind of mobile game, they actually provide and add value to the network effect. Because even if they play entirely for free, they actually are giving value to the people who are willing to pay. After all, if you go into an empty lobby and there's nobody to compete with, right, then you're not going to pay because it seems like a game that nobody wants to play and there's nobody to compete with. So effectively, everyone who's playing for free is really, if you think about it, another perspective is it's working for the game. Now, of course, they're having fun doing so. So therefore, from their vantage point, it's like, oh, I'm enjoying this. I like this anyway, so I don't need to be paid for it. But really what play to earn does, and what blockchain gaming or generally tokenization does, it finds a way in which it can create a value construct for the network effect embedded within that particular community, has a market value of some sort, and then basically allows it to be, distributed through some kind of mechanism. And again, you don't have to look at it as making money. It's just the fact that it's contained in there. When you take a look, for instance, at sort of the big games today, whether this is like a Roblox or whether this is like, an Apex Legends or Fortnite or any one of the big games out there, all the people who are playing the game, which is the vast majority, they don't pay any money. How much of their time and contribution is actually part of the value of that game? The multi-billions of dollars that they're generating every year is not possible if it wasn't for the free players. What fraction, or percentage, not fraction, I would say big percentage really, of that ought to be owned by the end users? And our perspective is that it is perhaps maybe even the majority, because if they weren't playing the game, then nobody else would pay for it, right? So that's kind of how to think of why play to earn even exists, and why, frankly, sort of tokenization is a really powerful construct inside games. The criticism I think that people have towards it is that when they look at something like Axie Infinity, which really made the concept have more, mainstream attention, is that they look at a few things. They say, well, this seems like a really simple game. For us, we describe Axie Infinity as a little bit like what Angry Birds was to mobile gaming, Axie Infinity was to blockchain gaming. Mm-hmm. And I think this is the thing here where, just like back in the day, sort of avid hardcore gamer was not going to play Angry Birds. That same gamer was also not going to be playing Axie Infinity, except now this idea that a game that may appear on the surface to be so simple is generating billions of dollars of value seems unbelievable to them. That's partially because gamers don't understand what the game economics are behind it. Really, all that Axie Infinity and other play-to-earn games are doing is sharing the value of that network effect back to its end users. And some may be more valuable than others. I mean, that's entirely possible that there are games out there where, it might literally be only worth 50 cents to $1 And there's certain other kind of games out there that actually are worth $15 to $20, which is another way to translate ARPU. So in the mobile gaming world, we obsess about this idea of ARPU, right? Average revenue per user. And actually, we also specifically then also focus on average revenue per paying user, right? And typically the average revenue per paying user is in the thousands of dollars, right? But when it averages across a sort of total user space, it's sort of $1, $5, $10, $15, whatever that may be. The vast majority of games out there in the world today have an ARPU less than $1, especially from the indie game developers. But the top games in the world, the League of Legends and those type of, Clash of Clans type of games, the Clash Royale type of games, actually have ARPUs in the $50, $100, maybe even hundreds of dollars range, which obviously means that they're very successful. They can spend more on marketing. But that's actually, if you think about it in sum total, that's another way to translate the distributed value, because an ARPU is an average revenue per user. So how much of that average revenue per user that you're generating as a company, for instance, ought to really be shared to the community for adding to the network effect? And that's really what this is. And what put from that perspective, it may simply be just $1 per user, for instance. But that dollar per user for that particular game might be the fair distribution available to the end user within that particular game. So it's not to be looked at simply as this is a way to make money. Money is already being made in every game today. They just don't books with you. They don't account for what actually happens. Here with blockchain, it's transparent. You can see how much is generated. You can see the activity, up and down. And honestly, I don't think any different from free-to-play games today in terms of its construct. It's just how it's shared.
Right. I think there's a lot to unpack there. Right now, as we're shifting the narrative from consumer to game developer to now a consumer-owned platform, there's a lot of conversation around, okay, well, we're giving value back to the users. But what does that actually mean? Let's talk a bit about property rights on the digital world. Like, what is it that actually empowers in the longer term? Because right now it feels like a very vague term. Just saying, hey, we're giving more power to the users. I don't know if users quite know what kind of power they're working with here. How does that build towards the long term?
But when the concept of property rights in the physical world was actually established and people started talking about the rights of man, basically natural rights and all that fun stuff, the majority of the world also had no idea what that meant, right? They were basically sort of still trying to grapple with this concept that they could actually own property. And nobody necessarily imagined the implications of what property rights ended up doing for innovation, capitalism, economic activity, and frankly, democracy. Right? These are all things that tie together. But for most people, that was something that was invisible because they have to really worry about the then and now. Right? They didn't really have the luxury of thinking about, what are the implications 100 years from now? What does it mean for my future generations? These are concepts that most people don't have the luxury of thinking about just because of their personal circumstances and perhaps even just broad awareness. And I think the same is true today when you think about sort of tokenization, blockchain, and to an extent, GameFi and play to earn. And just as I had mentioned earlier, right, some of them will have long-term effects. Many of them might only be temporary, just in the sense that just because you're launching a blockchain game doesn't mean that the assets may persist, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the game itself is a success, right? These are all question marks that depend on many factors here. And they're going to be different than the mobile gaming side, but there's no guarantee that they will survive or that they will even thrive and be very successful. Now, one thing here again is the value construct though changes. So the other thing that happens in mobile gaming as people spend a lot of money on these the ARPPU, right, the paying user, is that in order to obtain them, literally some up to 70 to 80% of that revenue often goes into marketing, particularly for the smaller companies, because they haven't yet reached that scale. So that means that while a company may make billions of dollars, for instance, in gaming revenue, they will spend basically billions of dollars in advertising, whether this is on Facebook, Apple, or Google, or any one of these other platforms. And the rise in advertising, and if you take a look at how much of advertising, particularly mobile advertising, comes from gaming companies, it is very large. Perhaps maybe even at one point the majority. So really what's happening here is the revenue goes straight back to the advertising platforms, whose job obviously is to help acquire customers. Now, in play to earn or in blockchain games, the majority of that value goes back to the end user, who become the agents, if you will, who are the ones who are motivated to promote the game, talk about it, because they're earning also relative income from that game for a certain group of people. And again, this might not be for everyone. Not every person wants to go out there and promote the game because maybe they could benefit from this. They just want to have fun. But there are those that do, right? And they might get some level of disproportionate reward for creating more economic activity inside the game, which is far more scalable, more powerful, because what happens is that the economy doesn't leave the ecosystem, right? So the capital that goes inside as a reward system to promote economic activity inside the game that then goes and promotes, for instance, the outside activity to bring in end of users stays within a game, right? As opposed to going to a third-party advertising agency that really doesn't care anything about your game. Their whole purpose is just to make as much money from you and extract as much value from you as possible and move on. I guess in Web2 gaming has been the constant struggle. In fact, cost per user acquisition is the biggest Achilles heel, if you will, for any indie company in the gaming world. They make a fantastic game, but they don't have marketing budget. And they have an inability to grow because of the fact that the CPA is just way, way too high. And they can't because they're being priced out because the large gaming companies that are out there basically are just, bidding for everything. And the inventory supply relative to the cost that you're able to pay basically prices them out and has really contributed heavily towards the death of indie gaming, which was really thriving 10 years ago and has really been struggling in the past because of that. So that's kind of a broad thing. Now, what happens when you break up this sort of monopoly, which decentralization does, where now you have more ability to make money with really smaller audiences because value goes back into the ecosystem, right? I mean, people sometimes forget that despite the billions of dollars of value that was generated by Axie Infinity, its users, which has been part of the criticism, is still only in the millions of customers of active players, which in the gaming context is a tiny, tiny number. Now, one way to say is, it's such a small number, it's insignificant in terms of end users, but in terms of revenues, they're amongst the biggest gaming companies in the world. So look at that slightly differently. What does it actually mean about the economic potential of these games? In fact, you can run a very, very successful play-to-earn blockchain game with really only hundreds of thousands of customers. What that means is also much more customer choice as well, because we're no longer driven towards just a few blockbuster games that we all have to play, because that's the only way that's sustainable. But now we have a choice of potentially tens, if not hundreds of thousands of games that can survive or thrive even, and provide really, really unique experiences that we can't really have today, because if we don't follow a certain formula, then the company in question cannot survive. And that's why you have less choice. So there's not just a micro benefit from an end user. Well, what's in it for me? Why would I want to play a game to make money? That's obviously the inside perspective in terms of, I don't want to play this, so I don't care. It's the macro actually that matters more here, which is that now this framework allows for much more diversity, much more inclusivity. Now, the example that I often give is, well, imagine if the whole world can only sustain its food consumption, if it had to be up to the mass audience, for instance, right? That meant we all would have to be eating McDonald's every day. We couldn't have big food experiences, right? We couldn't have Michelin star restaurants or unique small family-run restaurants because they wouldn't be sustainable, for instance, right? Now, this brings it back because the economies and the economic scale is more fairly distributed. If indie game developers could start getting back to making without spending so much in marketing, basically sort of to the average ARPUs that they're currently making, which, by the way, are likely never going to be as large as the big game companies. Like, they may not have the budget to create a game that would attract the same revenue, right? Because after all, it's the difference between like an indie movie versus a Hollywood blockbuster, right? Hollywood blockbusters cost a lot more to make. Sure, they make more revenue as well. That doesn't mean that people stop watching TV shows or stop enjoying indie productions. It's just that they're not sustainable in the gaming world. And for the end user, there's the added benefit of having the ownership is another way of also owning the legacy of what you've invested in. Again, when you think of property rights, property rights is not just a concept of economic activity. It's actually a social identifier. Everything we purchase in the world today is a signal of who we are. Whether we buy a car, whether we buy a watch, whether we buy clothes, expensive or cheap, whatever it is, we're making a statement about who we are. And there's also history and legacy attached to it. And in the digital space, with blockchain, you can now own that legacy and pass it on. And, someone else, another game studio might want to say, hey, I want to offer you a service and I want to transfer this over to you and so you can have activity inside another game. You can do that. In fact, that's happening right now. In one of our games called F1 Delta Time, which basically had to shut down as a game because of no more continued licensing rights for F1, the assets in themselves still exist on chain, because you have ownership of it. We just don't have the capacity officially as Animoca Brands to make a game for it anymore. And we also don't have the ability to make new assets. And that's fair. But it's now emerged that there's other game companies out there that have come out and said, we have a game that allows you to use these assets and come in and then enjoy it, right? So this is a third-party company called 99 Stars that basically has announced that they will support the former F1 Delta Time assets. And that's something that just couldn't happen in a traditional gaming environment, because once the game shuts down, then all the assets are gone and all the legacy and the history is gone. And I think this permissionless nature provides for some very new innovation that people can construct on top of that wasn't possible before.
There's so many things to unpack there. I love that example where they're reusing existing assets from another game, because I like the idea that you're also building on top of something instead of taking value and just completely erasing it and rebuilding from scratch. There's actually kind of that reusability aspect, which is very interesting. The other is you talk about the McDonald's food example. That's a very vivid example. What it makes me think about is all of the industries that are actually trapped in that state. It is not just gaming. It is not just the gaming distribution issue. It is entertainment. It's certain other like very monopolistic industries as well. So not that blockchain technology is going to disrupt that in the near term, but I could see a future where this model really starts to be adopted in other domains as well.
I mean, just to add on that, I grew up in Vienna, right, in a classical music background. And so as a result, I have an interest in classical music, and I can't find anything on Spotify. It's really hard because of the way that classical music is set up, because of the fact that really, if you think about classical music, it's probably the biggest cover artist industry in the world, just because you're reinterpreting works from masters of the past. But because of the numbering system and the description of it, Spotify isn't set up for that. And I don't think Spotify really cares, because at the end of the day, classical music cannot compete with, Billboard Top 10. And so what does it really do if we're all listening music on Spotify? Actually, outside of the fact that discoverability starts to sort of wane, right? There's also the general access to it. So I wouldn't say it's intentional censorship, but it becomes a form of censorship, because the platform where I'm actually listening to music to now basically removes things, or sort of removes access, or no longer recommends you things because it's not as profitable to them as a platform. So I'm a prolific listener of classical music, but yet my recommended list rarely comes up with classical music, for instance, which is kind of fascinating.
Yeah.
You're supposed to think of trying to find the patterns. And I don't know what the reason is. I'm not inside Spotify, but I can make a few assumptions. And one of them is probably maybe they haven't designed algorithms that fit the way that classical music should be discovered, right? That's one. But then the second thing is, why would it try to sort of promote classical music when from an economic standpoint, it might not be as profitable, for instance, for them, right? Which of course creates this sort of flywheel where the incentives are then about not creating something that might be unique, but rather something that is mainstream again, right? And so, as you said earlier as well, all industries are affected by this thinking through sort of centralized monopolies, who then at the end of the day do things that benefit them and not really the community, because it's not as profitable for them.
Yeah, that's powerful. There's almost like a preservation of culture aspect to all of this blockchain gaming stuff. So I do want to talk about economic activity. So you mentioned this is going to foster new types of economic activity. There's kind of two components to it. Right now, there's a lot of very heavy capitalistic short-term money gain activity on the GameFi scene. But then there's also other interesting behaviors that we are seeing emerging in terms of people creating new marketplaces for themselves, creating new sort of models for themselves. One example is just guilds, and YGG being a huge example of that. So can you kind of talk on both? How are we going to kind of get out of the short-term situation? Like, how does that evolve? And then what are some of those new behaviors that are going to get us out of this very short-term money-making pump and dump situation?
So when you look at the perspective of what actual property rights delivers, right, is the fact that really, if you think about the physical world, true decentralized property rights is the reason why much of the innovation, if not most of the innovation that we see today in the world is possible. Because you can now do that in a manner which is permissionless. The fact that we have decentralized ownership of cars, which is one of our favorite examples, is the reason why Uber and Lyft can exist, is the reason why you have gas stations, so people constructing roads, people making car parks, people are sort of becoming mechanics. The industry around the ownership of cars is far, far greater than the automotive industry in and of itself in terms of sales of cars. But what's also interesting in this example is that the value and the utility of these cars has also expanded because of all the additional service layers that are attached onto the value of the car. Like, for instance, when the car was first invented, it was really to replace the horseless carriage, right? To create a horseless carriage, where you can basically just transport perhaps more efficiently from one place to another, and perhaps maybe even more economically. But then someone invented 30 years ago the baby seat, and now it became a device that could safely transport, for instance, children as well in a more comfortable manner. And when the car was first invented, nobody thought about that as a device, as a system that you could transport children. Maybe, but that wasn't the design. And today, you wouldn't buy a car if it didn't have the ability to incorporate one of the many choices of baby seats that you would put in. It would be a negative thing, for instance, right? Or maybe the way that we decide about sort of maybe places to stay based on the fact that they might have a charging station or not, right? So these are all things that add value to the ownership of a car. And the way we look at that is really what that means is that the car itself creates and has embedded network effects. The embedded network effect is the ability for people to create new constructs of value, which may be utilitarian, but can also just simply be sort of social constructs. Like, I want to paint my car pink, right? Well, who can help me do that? I want to put a certain logo on it. I want to earn, number plates are like an incredibly fascinating social identifier of cars. Really, if you think about it, really, it's owning a number plate. What is that supposed to mean? But, people bid them on auctions because they have certain kind of value attached to your car, right? So the whole construct of ownership of cars, because of decentralized ownership, is now become so powerful. And actually, that is the construct of everything we have in the physical world. If you look at, for instance, the fact that we can own our house, physical house, and there's certainty that you can own that. That's the reason why a bank can give you a 20 or 30-year mortgage, right? If you don't have ownership of that, you can't do that. So all these capital benefits start to also flow into it because of ownership. So now we take that to the digital world, and we think the exact same thing will happen, which is that when you have true digital property rights and you have the same effects as you have in the physical world, people will construct third-party network effects on them. Some of them for utility, some of them for sort of capital purposes, and some of them for social identifiers, and it adds value to that. And we're seeing that happening today already, right? Whether this is Bored Ape, Sandbox Land, or, Axie Infinity as well. YGG is a great example of a company that actually they're the reason why Axie grew the way that it did, is where they created essentially an Uber-like service on top of the decentralized ownership of Axies. They didn't really have to go to Sky Mavis and say, are we allowed to use these Axies? May we please? That's not how it works. You can just basically just work with the people who own Axies, do a business deal with them, or buy Axies on market yourself, and then build a business. And today, there's hundreds and hundreds of guilds that are on top of Axie Infinity and other games because of that ownership paradigm. So that in itself, I think, is going to flip things upside down as well. Like, for instance, the future of esports in our perspective is going to be very much in the gaming guild direction. I don't think existing esports organizations can really survive on the basis of their current model because they don't have ownership in anything that they do. So that's the long-term value. Now, when you talk about sort of the speculative qualities and the fact that there's, I guess, a form of over-financification of that, well, to me, I think this is part of the journey, right? Which is, now what we've really done is expose the true capitalist nature of everything we do, at least in entertainment and gaming in this particular case, right? And one of the criticisms that many gamers have is, I don't want fun to be financified, right? I don't want to sort of be exposed in the gaming world as it is in the real world in terms of economics and all the capital flows. Well, the issue right now you don't realize is that as a gamer, you're already heavily financified. It just ends up benefiting the one company. It doesn't get distributed, right? So what it does is it exposes, really, if you think about it, the balance sheet of the business, right? You get to see everything around it. You have the records, you understand the value, and then you share that value. And then people start looking at that and saying, oh, well, if there's so much value inside an ecosystem, then how can I best extract that for those who are maybe looking to be extractive from that and creating systems around that as well? That happens as it happens in an open economy. When you open up economic frameworks and you make them transparent, then people, for better or for worse, will look at the economic gain that they can have. But that in itself as a design, which is the capitalist incentive, is then to create innovation on top of that. Right. So what then happens is that gaming companies themselves, the assets that are out there, actually have open composability on top of them, creating, for instance, whether it's lending platforms, for instance, whether it's sort of rental platforms, or maybe the ability to use the items in another game in another way or in a different construct. These are things that then just add more value to the ecosystem and also add value to those people who own it. So you could say, is this welcome? Well, I think, unless we are steering away from capitalist thinking in the world, where we think that is no longer the right framework to think about the future of driving innovation, and I guess you could say conserving some of the democratic values that we think are important, then perhaps we have to rethink that. But right now, I think capitalism is still, in reshaped form, one of the most powerful ways to do that. And that basically leads to the ability to have this decentralized ownership. I think it's part of that journey because we're also early. We may forget that when people first moved to America, like hundreds of years ago, for instance, what was the world like back then, right? Or people who settled in the early days, there was a lot of prospecting that took place as well, whether it's the gold rush in Alaska, whether it's, whatever other industries around, people were looking at opportunity. But what did it do? It brought in investment. It brought in people who were basically sort of building and constructing opportunities, and it brought industries around it as well. The fact that people were prospecting, for instance, in Alaska for gold allowed for other industries to flourish to service the people that were sort of digging for that gold. So I think it just becomes a much more powerful way in which you can drive growth as a whole, which is why I think blockchain gaming, broadly speaking, have such an unfair advantage to any traditional gaming framework, because your entire community could be engaged in this matter, which they do.
There's no question that democracy results in innovation. Capitalistic incentives also create innovation. But I do want to talk potentially about the dark side of moving towards a very hyper-capitalistic society. So once there is better ways to calculate units of value to attribute that to single individuals and players, which is kind of where we're trending towards. On the blockchain, every activity is going to be measured. Everything's going to be able to trail back to like the originator of the activities, stuff like that. It's going to be tough for people to not view every single activity as an economic activity, right? And then if we are moving towards caring so much about property rights and ownership of assets, then what happens when there's accumulation of too much assets? Are we going to move towards a world of inequality where certain people hoard a lot of assets and other people don't have any capital?
When it comes to the question of hypercapitalism or just capitalism broadly, there's a few things here, I think, to sort of identify. The first one is that when you think about what went wrong, I guess, with capitalism today versus where it was perhaps a much more powerful construct, the idea of property rights, even say hundreds of years ago when it was first sort of really established as a natural right for people, is that who owns the means of production, right? And one of the challenges that we have right now, and even today, is that the ownership of that production, most of the people who labor actually don't own the means of that production. It's owned by, I guess, the business owners, and which kind of comes to the whole class conflict theory, right? And we don't have to theorize about that, but that's kind of one of the big challenges around the fact that, there's inequity caused by the fact that people who have the capital own the machines that generate the value, and people who work on them actually don't enjoy the capital benefits because they don't own the resource that creates that value. And they also don't own the machines that can create that value, right? And therefore, inequity and inequality continues to sort of grow as it has, especially in the last few decades. And the paradigm to think of this, and the way we think about this, is data. So where the resource in the past might have been energy or cotton or natural goods, the resource of the present and the future is data. And data is the most valuable resource on earth as we see it. And you just really have to take a look at the biggest companies in the world, and it's populated really by companies like Apple and Microsoft and Facebook and Tencent and Alibaba and Amazon. And what are all these companies? I mean, you could say, they're software companies, but really they're data companies. They own your data, right? They're farming our time to create this valuable data. And then they create these powerful network effects, which they own as per the terms of service. Right? We don't own the value that is generated from that data. And so we're being naturally exploited. And I think of this as a way that we're all digitally colonized for the most part. And we sort of exist a digital life of serfdom in these digital kingdoms. That's kind of where we are today in the digital world. Now, in the future, we also can project that the typical kind of jobs, such as truck drivers or factory work or so on, is going to be less and less valuable, as labor has been, the classic type of labor that we identify with. And so what does that really mean, right? And people often toyed around with the idea or talked about like universal basic income as a way to make sure that everyone is provided for, and have kind of Gene Roddenberry Star Trek type future where money doesn't matter anymore, right? And where everyone has everything they need, and we can just start to pursue our creative passions, which maybe has its own issues, but is sort of what some people have thought about. But I think really what the big change here is, unlike the other resources that are owned by the property that you might physically, if you own the land, then you have the ability to extract value from that property. The difference here is that this property comes from us. So what happens, for instance, if all of us decide not to use Facebook, which of course is not likely to happen, but if we all stopped using Facebook, what is the value of Facebook? Nothing, because Facebook has lost its capacity to produce the data that gives it its value in the network effect. Who produces that data? All of us. So we think of the future not in the context of a universal basic income, but a kind of universal basic equity. Because if data as a construct can be considered a property right, like a natural right, or like a human right almost, right? Then actually all the economic benefits that flow from property rights to the contributors of that data goes back to the people who offered that data. Right? It's a little bit like, I own a small plot of land that just continually creates natural resources, whether this is cotton or something. And either you pay me a fair wage for extracting value from my property, or you give me a share of that property because I gave it to you, right? Which is normal. In business, we do that all the time. So it means that anyone who is online now has the capacity to own equity in everything they do. So I think what that means is that when we talk about, on one hand, you'd say hypercapitalism. On the other hand, I would maybe look at it more from a perspective of more inclusion from a capitalist perspective. Because the balancing act isn't necessarily just the fact that there's only a select few that can benefit from it. It's about the fact that how do you distribute as much of that value broadly across so that the benefits of capitalism can be shared to as wide as an audience as opposed to just a select few, which is what's been happening, right? Because of the fact that the means of production and the ability in the past were owned by a select few that basically generate value from you because you were the ones that were you own the extraction means, right? And today we see that like Facebook owns your data, actually, if you think about it, right? You can take the data back if you want, but you yourself lack the ability to create value from this because you don't have the factory of AI, you don't have the machine, but the platform does. In this construct, the platform, like in gaming, for instance, with play to earn, is required to share value back to you if it doesn't pay you a fair wage for that. So I think that's basically how that works. Now, capital inefficiencies or income inequality in and of itself, I think, is an important construct. And it's an important construct because it provides the appropriate incentive to do harder kinds of work and to put more effort into it. If we all had the same kind of income, which is, of course, the sort of ultra-communist perspective, perhaps, right? Then what incentive do we have as people to take and do the harder types of work out there? So I think the idea here really that you need to have a form of income inequality to drive incentives remains still a powerful one. And is a very capitalist idea, of course, right? So you still need that, but you need to at least be able to be fairly rewarded. And I think the issue that we see in the capitalist setup is not that capitalism in and of itself is the problem. It's the fact that capital is unevenly distributed. And it used to be that antitrust was supposed to take care of this type of stuff, but, has clearly failed. I mean, I don't see, anywhere in the world that is really trying to do anything around antitrust. They don't really know what to do because of the pace of technology. And so I think digital decentralized ownership, as we see on blockchain, actually, I think will solve that in a big way.
Yeah, that's really helpful as ways to think about it. So speaking of the issues with capitalism today, talking about communism versus capitalism, and just in general, having a perspective on where we're headed from a political ideology perspective, I want to clear up how to think about decentralization as it pertains to governance or civility. I don't know, even personally, as someone who spent a lot of time in the space, I still sometimes equate this phase of really wanting decentralization as actually moving us towards kind of anarchy. And I don't think that's where we want to end up. And so what is the reaction of Web3 to right now, which I think a lot of people have a good idea of, but let's talk about it a little bit more. And then how are we going to settle into more of a natural order? What is going to be social security in the future when everything is very decentralized? How are we going to have governing bodies or any sense of civility and structure if everyone's an independent agent?
So the way we think of, Web3 and decentralization is not necessarily a future that looks like anarchy. That's not the idea. But it's about the framework of transparency and certainty that you can have your digital property rights. And also the idea that you're entitled to this. If you think about this in the physical world, in America, there's democracy and everyone has an assumption of the natural rights, the rights of man, the right to life and liberty and his security, right? This concept is in human history, a blip in terms of human existence, where these rights that we consider completely normal, actually most of humanity never had the benefit of the right, never even assumed that was a right that they were entitled to. And have we achieved this? No. I mean, we haven't achieved this at all in terms of really where everyone has everything. There are many inequalities that happen even in the champions of this, like in the US, for instance. I remember growing up in Austria, I had a completely different image of the US. And then when I actually sort of landed in the US, this was in the early 90s at the height of the recession, I was like, oh my goodness, this is not what I imagined at all, right? I saw income disparity, I saw poverty everywhere because of the recession that took place at the time. Meanwhile in Austria, all I saw on TV was, like Baywatch and Knight Rider. And I was like, oh my goodness, this is not America at all. But what never left was the idea of what America was supposed to represent, which is, equal opportunity, the hope, the fact that there were many stories of people who came with nothing and achieved something because they had equal opportunity, or at least the idea of equal opportunity. And when you see the American flag, or when you look at the Statue of Liberty, what does it tell you? It's not really the fact that we have to achieve this exactly to the point. It's perhaps a struggle to try to get to the best optimal place there. But the idea that you're entitled to this, that this is in fact what you should strive for, that doesn't go away. That's Web3. Web3 isn't necessarily this idea that we all have to have complete decentralized ownership of everything. We do have decentralized ownership. That's the mechanism in which it's secured. But that doesn't mean that every game is going to be run in a decentralized fashion, nor does it mean that everything is sort of decided by mass consensus, which is one way to ensure protection. But I don't think anyone expects, even in a DAO, that everyone has to vote on every single decision, right? They're electing people to do so, right? Which is how the democratic framework works. But what won't go away is this idea that you're entitled to this now, right? That you will no longer accept that you're going to be sitting inside a digital kingdom that tells you how you can run your life. The fact that Apple can completely decide which apps can or cannot be seen, for instance. I mean, the fact that Epic can still not launch their apps on the App Store is both incredible and scary if you think about that. And so what that does is it changes that paradigm there. And to the question of why decentralization matters, it's the certainty of that ownership. The fact that in order for the biggest decisions, which is your property rights, to be able to sort of alter, you need the consensus of everyone on chain. But in order for property rights in America to change, where suddenly, the president says, I own everything and, you have no property rights, well, what does he have to do? He needs to get consensus from the country first. How does he obtain that? Well, he probably never will, right? Unless he has a much better model. And that's basically what decentralization, I think, this case really provides for, which is that now on chain, my assets are secure, which means that people can compose new innovation and new experiences on that ownership. Even the creator of that asset can no longer take it away. If he needs to take it away, he needs to get consensus, or he needs to fork, right? Either way, there's a mechanism that protects the ownership of that, which allows essentially your own protection of these assets. The enforceability of these things and so on all come down to sort of ensuring that we have a framework where people are, I guess, elected into that place, whether it's a delegation system, whether it's representative, right? We haven't figured that out yet. In fact, democracy is still very, very young as a concept. And one of the challenges about democracy broadly is that it's very expensive and very costly, even for human life, to be sort of experimenting on live democracies, right? You can't completely change it without potentially devastating consequences. But actually in Web3, with DAOs, for instance, you can iterate on democratic principles, but at the rate of technology. And not all of them will succeed. Maybe many of them will fail. But through that process, as something that will no longer be as expensive as it would be to iterate on actual living democracies that are in the physical world, we can start to create an experiment and looking at some of the theories and then implementing them in action to see what it's like in the metaverse. And then perhaps that will inform. I actually think that some of the models that are going to be created in Web3 through blockchain in terms of decentralized structures and how we run certain things are going to influence the physical world because they will end up becoming more efficient. Now, technology has always influenced the physical world, if you think about it, right? In ways that we couldn't imagine, but they have, right? And the same thing will happen here, where we'll come up with new frameworks and new ideas because of what we now see is possible that we might have theorized about, but we're frankly just too scared to try in the physical world, which is the wisdom of the crowds. Someone else will emerge from there, come with an idea that we haven't thought of and come up with a better model that we can iterate on. So I view decentralization really as sort of the framework for constructing that, not as the end goal in terms of, we're all decentralized. And so we're all sort of our free agents. And, humanity doesn't work that way. We are social creatures. We are anyway forming social entities every single day to come together. I think part of that thinking where people were sort of concerned around this is the assumption that most people are just simply doing things just for themselves, right? And I guess in the earliest days, and this is not to knock the finance sector, but Wall Street has that particular reputation because that's how they were constructed, right? Which is basically the financial aspect of the world. And crypto began as a financial instrument, right? Bitcoin was born because of the frustrations of the financial market and became something that initially attracted many of the finance world in there. But that's not how the rest of the world works. That's how a subset of the world might work, right? And because it started this way, it may feel much more there. So a lot of people are mostly concerned around that aspect. But most of us in the world don't do that. We treasure our cultures, we treasure our families, we treasure our particular societies. We love our country, right? There are things that we do today might be even considered altruistic in form, but we take it for granted. Right? The fact that we help people on the street, for instance, or the fact that we share ideas with strangers, the fact that we teach, the fact that we help others, they don't make headlines, but they happen far, far more than the person who's like, basically sort of extracting money from you every day, or the person who stole from you. That might make the headlines, but that's not how it works. Because if the whole world today functioned this way, then we would be in chaos anyway. So I think generally, obviously I'm fairly optimistic about this, but given the better choices, we want to do good things. The problem is that because we have social inequality, and because there's a challenge in terms of being included in a manner, because we are excluded, because we don't have the means to get in, that forces people to basically do things that would be socially unacceptable. But that's in many cases, when you look at, for instance, the economic stratification in places like the US, is a case of policies of the past that have created what it is today, which are being unwound today, but take time to heal. But ultimately, very few people out there are intentionally to try to harm.
Yeah, those are good reminders. I'm also a techno optimist, so I do believe that we will figure it out. But there are a lot of things right now that just feel so far from that. Some examples is, voting and governance and making decisions in DAOs. It's overwhelming how many decisions that I don't even know if it even matters you're getting solicited for. And what I worry about is, what if people have too many decisions to make all the time? Either, you're voting based on the lowest common denominator, or people actually just stop voting because they don't care anymore. They've become jaded, tired, and they don't care. And then votes are typically going to be informed by people who have very vested interest, or the loudest voices, or ulterior motives. So that's kind of one thing. I don't think there's a short-term solution, but something I think about.
Maybe just to sort of address that, I understand the concern obviously clearly, right? One of the things that often I feel are maybe not, at least from our perspective, misunderstood about, where democracy fits is not necessarily that it's just, one criticism is that if you have, from a DAO standpoint, everyone make a decision, then you cater to the lowest common denominator, and you basically have the tyranny of the masses, and you can never have progress because every decision has to be mass consensus that may only benefit them, or and so on. And actually, I don't agree with this perspective, but I understand the sentiment. But I also think it's lazy. And the reason why I think that is because I think the role of a democratic framework is to bring people to your level, not to say that I know better than you and I make that decision. So in other words, if I want to get my decision put forward, then I need to make the appropriate arguments, and I need to bring you to that level, right? The best defender of democracy is education. If you have people who are not educated, then the democracy is at risk, clearly, right? So the job here is to bring people higher to the level where people understand why it's important, why it's valuable. And, the fact that most of the world, even in biggest democracies in the world, you don't have 100% turnout means that we still have a way to go, right? In terms of understanding why it's valuable, why it's important. But that's part of that job, right? And I think the idea here, therefore, is from a DAO principle as well. As I'm involved, for instance, in the ApeCoin DAO, there's many things and many discussions that take place, and people assuming ulterior incentives and making assumptions about things that maybe might be more in the area of conspiracy theories. But then how do you combat that? Well, you have to be transparent about it. You have to explain it. You have to keep talking about it. And this might not be for everyone. So naturally, there will be some people that are more happier to be exposed this way. But I guess you need to do that in order to have transparent leadership, because that's the other thing. The leaders that are out there need to be able to have legitimacy. So when you think of a DAO or democracy, what they do is they legitimize a leader to act on the behalf of, country, company, whichever, right? And process doesn't have to come entirely from being elected. The DAO mechanism just allows you to sort of establish that legitimacy just because of the fact that the community or the country or whatever has voted you in. That's one way to do it. But the other one is through achievement, right? Like, for instance, many companies today have established legitimate leaders because of what they've done for the company, and nobody questions it because they do a great job. Would they be naturally elected? Maybe not, but they have legitimacy because everyone knows that they're doing a really good job. So it's about the creating a form of legitimacy that then allows people to rally around that. Not everyone will have time to look at everything, and not every person is going to look at every proposal. And I think people get hung up about this idea that, if it's a DAO, then every single step of the way we have to make a decision. No, right? That wouldn't work. It's more about the fact that whoever is there is now accountable. There's a transparency to the process, and that person has his reputation at stake as well. If he or she basically doesn't do a good job of this and fails to do so, there are consequences as well. That's really what all of this means from our perspective, rather than just the instant decisions that need to be made.
I really like the point about education, but it does kind of beg the question of how do you think about the role of governments and politicians and policymakers going into the future, right? I don't think a more business capitalistic unit is going to step up and say, hey, we're going to like rewrite the code of conducts for how business needs to be conducted in play to earn games. There has to be a broader governing body beyond that. So how do you see the current set of regulators be involved in this process? Should they? Should we create a new breed of politicians? Like, what do you think about that?
Well, first of all, as it is always in history, right? New politicians will emerge relative to their generation. And as more people are going to benefit from or require the space to grow as it is, there'll be, of course, increased activity in the area of politics. Like in the Philippines, for instance, particularly in the rural areas, promoting, play and earn and promoting blockchain activities is become a campaign election platform in some places because more and more people are employed in that manner. It's no different than people sort of campaigning on behalf of factory workers or different kind of unions or whatever industries that you want to sort of represent in order for you to potentially be elected, but also represent their interests. In that sense, I don't think it's going to be that different. I think regulation is important. Because just like you have with everything in the world, if abuse takes place, then you have to have a mechanism. There is no way that the metaverse can be excluded from the physical world. They are connected. When we started to enforce KYC in a number of our products, we received a lot of flack for that. Maybe everyone's like, oh my goodness, what are you doing? It's against the spirit of decentralization, whatever. But decentralization doesn't mean that we allow for bad actors to be involved, right? There is a process where you need to be accountable and transparent. And at the end of the day, we still physically eat and sleep, right? We still live in physical places. We have to pay our taxes, right? And I think on the topic of taxes, that's the important part here. The future of work isn't going to be people who are working in factories, right? The future of work is going to be digital. It's going to be in the metaverse. And so countries need to find a way in which they can appropriately tax that, which you can't do if you overregulate in a negative way, because then you stifle that industry. And we've seen this, right? Countries that have stifled technological innovation have suffered and struggled in terms of economic growth versus those that have opened up to it. And I think people are very keenly aware of that. It's interesting when Biden put out the executive order in terms of, okay, we need to be in this space in a meaningful manner. It's changed the perspective of what the US is. Yes, because of what happened with Terra, there's going to be stablecoin regulations. Honestly, I don't think that's a bad thing at all. In fact, that was kind of expected. Like, what took you so long? Especially when it comes to things like stablecoin. However, that doesn't necessarily mean that the US has a disadvantage. In fact, what's happening here is because of the executive order, the frame of thinking for the most part has changed. People are like, oh, well, what's a responsible way to address this as opposed to let's just shut this down? And what it forces is other countries around the world to start thinking as well. They're like, oh, well, we wanted to shut this down, but now we can't because leadership in that space will go somewhere else, because there's also a race to make sure that you stay relevant. It's like a country that doesn't allow internet and a country that does allow internet. Well, we see what happened, right? I think the same will happen here. So I think government and politics, although they typically lag behind, in this case, I think because of economic interests and the interests of their people, that they're going to adopt broadly positive regulation. I do believe that.
That is interesting. Well, speaking of what's happening with regulation right now, I do want to zoom back to today, what's happening, what's current. How would you get people to think about both investing in the Web3 space as well as GameFi, and as a consumer discerning value of what they should spend their money on or what games they should actually support in the near term, given it seems like we're taking a pretty major economic downturn?
Well, I mean, I guess the classic comment is always, don't bet more than you can in this particular case, right? Don't invest more than you can afford to lose, just especially if you're new to the space and you don't understand it well. The way that I tell people often about, for instance, for NFTs is think of it like buying a car, which is not as an investment, but for its utility perhaps, and maybe its social status, if that matters to you, right? Which is, by the way, how we think of physical items as well when we purchase stuff. In the same way that you wouldn't just walk into a store and just buy a car. Some of us might be able to do that. Most of us don't, right? We study, we talk to people, we read reviews, we do all that kind of stuff before we then make a decision to sort of engage in that. I think, with things like NFTs, it's the same. And the way that we like to think of NFTs is, broadly speaking, is to analyze its network effect. How do you analyze the network effect of that particular community which is typically represented by the NFTs. Well, you take a look at who else is building on it. You see how active the community is on different things like Discord. You engage, you talk to them, you see the products that are built. You make assumptions, perhaps, obviously, in terms of where other things might be built in the future, right? There's all this type of stuff that comes into play. And like, for instance, with our sandbox, the value of sandbox started to increase as more people started building on it. That added to the value of the network effect, because more and more celebrities, for instance, and big brands started to also create identities on Sandbox and create experiences, which then added to the network effect and the potential of growth that people saw in Sandbox, and so started to engage with that as well, right? So that's kind of one way to look at the space. I also think of this as a little bit like moving away from being a tourist and actually starting to become a citizen in space. That doesn't mean you have to be all in, but it does mean that you need to start have some kind of vested interest, even if it is small, because many people from the outside in observe. And the problem about observing is that you are a tourist. You will never fully understand the culture of what happens inside unless you actually live it. You are visiting it, for all the good and the bad, right? We can visit Japan 20 times a year, but we will not understand it fully until we live there, for instance, right? It's the same thing here. You need to be in the space, which means you need to at least semi-immigrate into the metaverse. That means you probably have to buy some NFTs, you have to start engaging in DeFi. And I don't mean, and this is the other thing, I don't mean trading crypto in like Coinbase or Binance, right? Which is, of course, maybe one entry point, but that's very different. There, you're trading. That's a very particular area of focus. What I'm talking about is getting engaged in the world of DeFi, understanding how that works. Start with small amount, don't go crazy, but engage and study that field. And anyone who's really fully engaged in that typically sort of goes all in, because it becomes a rabbit hole that just goes deeper and deeper. And again, I go back to what's the powerful thing here. The powerful thing isn't even just, oh, how can I make money here? Yeah, sure. I mean, that could be one of the opportunities. But it's this idea about owning your digital sovereignty, having the same equivalent effect of your rights of digital man, if you will, right? These are things that you can now have. And this idea becomes so powerful that people no longer want to leave it. And so this is very different. For instance, 3 years ago, back in 2018, there was a really, really big recession as well in terms of the crypto space. I mean, people forget maybe that Bitcoin was, I think, like $3,000. Ethereum at one point touched below 100, $80 or $90, for instance, right? That was back then. Those were really, really dark days. And part of the reason was that because the majority of the people in the space were not building, they were mostly trading. Right? And that was just the construct of the time. Today, yes, of course, you have volatility, sensitivity. Bitcoin is also down, but it's down at a level from in the high 20s, low 30s type of thing. Ethereum is hovering around 2000, right? It's a completely different thing. That's also because so many more people are building in the space. And we've tilted from being mostly speculators 4 years ago to being sort of, I'm not sure if it's mostly builders, but we're at a point where the builders are actually becoming a larger and larger group. And typically builders build and don't leave because they're investing and building in that space. And what I encourage people to do is to be in that particular space, to learn what people are building. Like you can be engaged in an economy without having to buy a house, right? You don't have to invest a lot in order to understand it, but you need to invest something so that you understand that space. I encourage everyone to at least try and experience it through that lens.
I really like that. So let's switch to more of the investment landscape. Animoca is a really, really unique investor in the space. You guys are a leader in many ways of figuring out how to really work with companies as well as foster the community and the ecosystem at large. So can you talk a little bit about first how you guys are actually working with different companies that you have invested in / co-collaborate with? And then what are just some trends or suggestions that you would give to other investors on how to be successful in the space in the long term?
But we are fairly unique in the sense that we're not a fund. So from our perspective, the majority of our investments are from our balance sheet, which allows us to have a very, very long-term view on things. And also we think of what it means in terms of sort of sharing and creating the shared value of what we hope the future of Web3 will look like. So when we invest in layer 1 and layer 2s, even though we make NFT games, for instance, as an example, or we will build metaverse projects like Sandbox, is really to ensure that we have an ability to play in the field as well. Now, it's a little bit like if you were to enter the space now, our entry point would just be higher because the cost of the market is just more expensive as it was, say 4 years ago. So the way that we invest is hedging ourselves in terms of our ability to sort of participate and continue to grow and shape the space in the future. The second thing around this is that we invest, at least our thesis, is around everything that helps grow the network effect of NFTs as the framework of digital property rights. And the reason we appear to be investing as prolifically as we do is because we want to make sure that the space is so large that all centralized players have no choice but to open up. And in some ways, you could say, with Instagram announcing, oh, we're going to support NFTs, for instance, that's sort of a recognition that NFTs are now a thing. And the fact that there is a market large enough that even Instagram has to acknowledge, as opposed to saying, we have our own digital identities and we have our own digital frameworks and you can all just build there and make money this way. No, now Instagram has to also accept NFTs, for instance, as a way of social identification, because it's become large enough as an industry that can no longer be ignored. And eventually, these network effects compound on each other such that even the largest of entities effectively have to capitulate and go into an open market. And we see this effect in the physical world, right? If you're not part of global free trade, then your economies are very small. And if you are part of free trade, then you get the benefit. But it also means you have to play by the rules of global free trade. You have to engage in a manner that literally forces you to be transparent, to be open, and to be fair. And of course, there's conflict that happens there. But at the end of the day, it still deviates within sort of the rules of that engagement, because you cannot afford to be excluded from this. So that's really our goal, right? Is to make sure that that becomes so large that everything basically is built on open frameworks. So you could say that the way that we're investing and thinking about this has sort of this particular drive and purpose, which I don't know that it would be necessarily recommended for individual investors to look at, because they probably have to look at it from a perspective of liquidity and exposure and so on, and maybe the risk appetite would be a little different there. So I don't recommend that as an approach, but just so people understand, why we invest the way that we do, because it does seem like we're investing very heavily, across the spectrum. But again, it's about building network effects on everything NFT related. We also have accelerators, and these accelerators currently incubating a sum total of close to 90 companies right now that are focusing on different areas. Again, it's all about expanding and growing that space. And we typically invest in two thought approaches. One of them is an ecosystem check, where we think this is very supportive. It's not core to what we do, but it's going to help the ecosystem, which is, a smaller check size. But today, smaller also means millions of dollars. It used to be hundreds of thousands of dollars, right? Whereas strategic ones are the ones where we get very engaged, where we might be a lead investor, or we might be a significant investor. We help them with a token. We help them with a launch. We invite them into more strategic engagements. All of our portfolios have access to everything we do. But really what it is the time and attention. Like, for instance, every portfolio companies can build anything they want on Sandbox, for instance. They don't need our permission to do so. And we can make that connection. But it's different than if you are very strategically tied to us, where we actually are engaged with regular meetings and so on. There's sort of a more passive investment approach, and then there's a very active investment approach. And because we invest out of balance sheet, we also have the flexibility to maintain a very, very long-term view on that. Now, for investors, as I say, people who want to just broadly invest, my recommendation is you have to study the space. And you'll get naturally better if you're inside it. I go back to this early example of getting out of being a tourist and actually becoming a citizen in the space. Then you'll understand that space better, because I think it is difficult for someone to just copy. I mean, if you want to just copy, then just invest in a fund. Seriously. So give it to someone who is a professional in the space, of which there's many of them out there who have great track records. Participate in them. And frankly, there's also, maybe one could say, maybe legally a little bit complex, but more and more investing structures are looking at DAO structures as well, where you can participate and have open exposure of what's happening. I mean, things like for the gaming guilds, their treasuries are transparent. You can see what they've invested in, you can see what they own. So you have a way in which you could participate in that, but you have to understand it first, right? I think it still goes down to the very basic thing, which is you need to have an understanding of it before you should invest, ideally. That's the best way in which you can then also be accountable and responsible for your own decisions. If you're not, then I think then you're really just gambling, right? And that's a different story.
Absolutely. I really hope that Animoca creates like a local's guide to the metaverse or something, because I think you guys have actually so much knowledge that a lot of institutional investors just don't. It's the complete Wild West, and it's really hard to transition from a tourist to be an actual citizen. My last question to you is more pertaining founders and just people who want to start to participate in the ecosystem. So what are some key questions or areas of pursuit that you would advise founders to do when they are thinking of coming into this space? And then the second is, what are some interesting roles or opportunities that are emerging for ICs or people who want to be operators at various different GameFi companies that are just interesting to know?
First, the space is drawing a lot of talent, which is the other thing to look at. GameFi, broadly speaking, is bringing in many of the smartest people from the gaming industry, for instance, in there, which if you don't necessarily follow the money, you can certainly follow the talent, right? And take a look at where are some of the smartest people building. That's one thing to look at as a macro. To learn from the space, I would say, or to take a look at job opportunities or look at other opportunities there. I think the easiest thing is trying to understand it. It's much stronger from a perspective of a recruiting standpoint if you already are in the space, somewhat, as opposed to, hey, I'm really curious about this. I want to apply for a job, right? That typically is a more weaker approach. That's not to say that isn't possible. It's not great for the company that's potentially looking to hire you, but also for yourself. You're doing yourself a little bit of a disservice as well, because you should be coming into the space where you at least have an idea about why you want to do it, right? As opposed to that just looks kind of interesting. Let's do that. I think the opportunities range from everything to anywhere, right? It's a little bit like the early days of the internet, or maybe even early mobile gaming days. The people who know smart contract developing, the people who can design tokenomics, the people who can sort of project manage in the space, the people who understand DeFi. The numbers of people who know that in terms of the demand is still very, very small. And of course, the prices and the value of those, essentially, as more people come in, will be sort of more equalized over time. But really, frankly speaking, if you are early in the space, you have an ability to make disproportionate value because of the fact that there's so few people who know the space for the time being. I remember, back in the late 90s, people used to spend millions of dollars making a website, right? I mean, just imagine that. But that's what happened. And why? Because website designers were just tough to find. People who knew HTML, as crazy as that sounds, and JavaScript were just like, oh, my goodness, JavaScript, here, take a job, right? And that's an opportunity. And that's something that, again, it's the economic opportunities that bring in people, right? It's that capitalist pursuit that brings in the smart people that then basically build the space. Mobile gaming was the same. If you knew how to make an app, in fact, if you knew Unity back about 10 plus years ago, then you were a hot commodity, right? And you were able to sort of command higher salaries as well, right? So knowing the space does matter. Being in the early trends gives people an advantage, not just in learning, but also from an economic standpoint.
That was Yat Siu, co-founder and chairman of Animoca Brands. You can find him on Twitter at ysiu, or you can check out all of the companies and projects that they invest and work with at animocabrands.com. If you like this episode, please leave a review in your podcast app of choice. Thank you for listening. This is your host, Annie Zhang, and I will see you in 2 weeks.